World War, those 40 crucial years, there were repeated debates about bombing and the experience of bombing. For example, in the First World War, the Germans launched a bombing campaign against the United Kingdom. They sent over Zeppelins and big airships and Gotha bombers, these gigantic bombing aircraft. They killed about 1,500 people, mainly as a result of inaccurate navigation, inaccurate bombing. They thought they were bombing a munitions factory in Liverpool, and actually they were bombing a residential district in Folkestone. And the result in the minds of people in England itself was to be horrified at the prospect of bigger bombers and more of them with more bombs on them, and the devastating effect that would have on civilization. Indeed, so great was the fear, at least on the part of civilian minds, that in the peace conferences in Geneva during the 1920s and early 1930s, not only was an endeavour made to ban bombing, to outlaw bombing in war, but indeed it was at one point mooted that flight, that aeroplanes should be banned, on the grounds that if there was one, somebody would throw a bomb out of it. Well, that didn't persuade anybody, largely because the militaries at the time had already grasped the potential of bombing. After all, the British had been using it very effectively in Iraq all during the 1920s to police the recalcitrant tribesmen there, and the person who was in command of that bombing endeavour in Iraq was a man called Arthur Harris. And Arthur Harris was of that school of thought, initiated by Douhet and others, that bombing was an extremely potent weapon which could bring a war to an end very swiftly, because it would terrorize the civilian population into persuading its own government to give up the struggle. There were quite different thoughts about bombing and what bombing was for and should be for here in the United States of America. Prior to the Second World War, the United States Army Air Force had drew up plans for how it would conduct a bombing campaign if it got involved in a struggle in Europe. And they decided that with a smaller force and smaller bombers, targeting their endeavours at genuine bottlenecks in transport, in the production of military equipment and aircraft, and very, very crucially, oil supplies, that they would be able to strangle the enemy war effort. And as it turned out, and as the bombing surveys found at the end of the Second World War, that was exactly right. One of the great contributions to winning the war in Europe was made by the United States Army Air Force, the mighty 8th based in England and the 15th based in Italy, most of whose endeavours were aimed at these bottleneck targets. And for proof, if one needed it, one has only to think of the day on which the Soviet army crossed the Vistula River heading westwards towards Berlin. They were met by no fewer than 12,000 panzers waiting on the Baranov bridgehead. These highly manoeuvrable, fast tanks which packed a lot of punch and which were very well manned, 12,000 of them waiting on the Baranov bridgehead. Not one of them could move because they didn't have any petrol. The fuel supplies had been severely interdicted mainly by American bombing in the period beforehand. Now, when the war seemed imminent, when people realized that it was about to break over the heads of people in Europe, and this was from the mid-1930s onwards, the anxiety about the effect of bombing was so great that all the major governments of Europe put into place plans for how they would deal with it. In London, for example, 60,000 additional hospital beds were provided. Something like 1 million, enough timber to make 1 million coffins was set aside. And in one of those tremendous acts of futility that all bureaucracies go in for, an extra 5 million death certificates were issued to local authorities. And this is a measure, in a way, of what the anxiety was, because, of course, people thought that on the very first day of war, a mighty fleet would come across the Channel and would bomb London flat, and there would be millions of people trying to stream into the countryside, and there would be chaos and there would be terror. And as it happened, actually, mere minutes after Neville Chamberlain announced that the United Kingdom was at war with Germany, the air raid alarms went off in London because a solitary French pilot had forgotten to file his flight plan on the way across the Channel. But that, too, was a measure of the anxiety that people felt about it. And against the background of that anxiety, Neville Chamberlain twice in the House of Commons, once before the war began and once in the so-called phony war period between the actual outbreak of war and the 10th of May when the Germans attacked in the West, had twice said in the House of Commons, His Majesty's government will never bomb civilians during the course of this war. He believed, on the authority of his advisors, that it was against international law because it was felt there by Chamberlain's government, as it was felt here in the United States of America, that the discussions that had been held in the preceding decades in effect amounted to something close to customary international law, and that it would be a crime in that law to bomb civilian targets. Of course, actually, the motivation for Chamberlain saying what he did about not bombing civilian targets was that Britain was very underprepared for the war and terrified that a great assault against the cities of the United Kingdom would be mounted by Germany, and so he was trying to persuade the Germans not to do it by saying that he wouldn't do it. So that was an important part of the motivation. But it was sincere enough for Bomber Command to be under very strict instructions that its aircraft should not cross the coast of continental Europe in case a bomb fell out of an airplane and onto a civilian. So the Bomber Command wasn't even allowed to cross the coast before the attack in the west on the 10th of May 1940. And after that attack, and right the way up until February 1942, and despite the Blitz, which about which the certain things would be said, because in fact it wasn't itself a genuine area bombing campaign. It was an attempt to paralyse the financial and administrative districts of London and to paralyse the industrial cities like Coventry and dock cities like Plymouth and so on. But even despite that, Bomber Command was under orders not to target civilian populations deliberately until February 1942. But increasingly, in the early years of the war, there was more and more acceptance of what we now call collateral damage. The fact that if you're attacking a military facility or a factory in a city, your bombs are going to fall on the people who live nearby. And the anxiety about doing that early in the war dissipated, as the morning mist does, with the sun coming up, so that by the time the infamous directive of 14th February 1942 was sent to Bomber Command saying, your primary target from now on will be the morale of the enemy population, by that time attitudes had changed. And I like to mention at this juncture that sometimes people say, isn't this all hindsight? Aren't you looking back at the war and raising questions about it from the comfort and relative safety of your armchair now in the early 21st century? To which my reply is that 2,500 years ago, Thucydides, in writing about the Peloponnesian War, said, I want to recount the history of this war in order to show how moral sensibility is coarsened by war, how when you're engaged in the struggle you care less and less as time goes by about what you do. And he gave as the sort of killer example of this the difference between the Athenians' attitude to Mytilene early in the war. Mytilene was a city on Lesbos which had breached the treaty that it had with Athens, and the Athenians discussed the question whether in punishment they should massacre the population of Mytilene. If they had bombers they would have done it that way, but in those days they didn't. They decided against it. They decided not to massacre the population, mainly for prudential reasons, but the fact that they had the debate at all had behind it a moral impulse. But 12 years later, when the city of Milos wouldn't play ball with Athens, there was no debate. The population was massacred. And Thucydides wanted people to be alert to this fact, to the coarsening effect of war. And it's a lesson that applies not just to the Second World War and to the bomber's story in that war, but to us at all points in our history, including now. Anyway, 14th of February 1942, the primary task of Bomber Command was to attack the morale of the enemy population. That meant systematic and repeated attacks on urban areas, on civilian populations, with the express purpose of killing and terrorizing as many of them as possible. Because the kind of aircraft, like the big Lancaster and Halifax and Stirling 4-engine bombers, which could carry tremendous bomb loads, twice the bomb load of a B-17 Flying Fortress, and the kind of weaponry, because that was still in process, and it wasn't really until 1943 that Sir Arthur Harris had the weapon that he wanted to carry out this anti-morale campaign against the German population. It was only then, in 1943, that the really great raids happened. And the first of them was the very aptly named Operation Gomorrah, which took place in late July, early August 1943, and in which the very first fire storm occurred. And it's been very eloquently written about by WWll in his essay, The Natural History of Destruction. And there he points out how many people of the about 40,000 people who were killed in that one night were asphyxiated in their cellars and in their air raid shelters. How many of them caught